Okay, so this session is about continuing the circular flow of income. We're going to start talking about how to measure GDP and what does that mean. And we're going to look at the three approaches: the expenditure approach, the income approach, and the production or output approach. So let's review a little bit the circular flow of income. And we said that basically, if we have a closed economy, an autarkic economy in which everything that is being produced is consumed, assuming that there's no government, no external sector, and no banking or financial institutions, then we will have a simple model like this one. Okay, so households produce, they provide factors of production. Firms are the ones actually who produce goods and services. And because we're not talking about just a barter economy, we're talking about the outflow or the money flow as an arrow that is going the opposite way in terms of factors of production and goods and services. So we have the real economy and the monetary flow in the circular flow of income, as we call it. Wages, rent, dividends or profits, and interests are actually the factors of production, payments or factor payments, as we call them. This is expressed in monetary terms. Actually, this is the factors of production in kind, which is labor, land, entrepreneurship, and capital. Goods and services are receiving back the money that households pay for buying goods and services. And in a closed economy, everything that is being produced is consumed. So the amount of money that is being received as income is the same as the consumption expenditure. Now, what is missing in this circular flow? You may think about other leakages and injections as we have talked before. So I'm going to leave these for you to fill in. We're going to have a discussion in the class to fill what is missing. But something else that is missing is also this model is not taking into consideration what we're calling as market failure. So we're not talking here about for example, cultural loss in terms of producing goods and services. We also are not talking about the environmental loss if we would be able to measure it in monetary terms. So actually this simple model is still not considering the real cost of production in terms of externalities. So if we add a framework here, we should actually complete this model when we talk about the environment that actually is supporting the circular flow. And the environment could be related with the natural environment. We may be also talking about the cultural environment, the social environment, etc. So all of these are topics that we have discussed before, which are important to have in mind when we think about this type of models that so far are not considering the bigger picture in terms of well-being, but just a market-based economy. Again, let's move on. We have actually national income, and we're gonna refer the national income as the total amount of money that is being received by households as a function of payments of their factors of production being used by firms. We also said that firms produce goods and services, but we also mentioned that the government could be also producing goods and services. And nowadays, we think about the government contracting private firms in order to produce public goods. But actually, the government could be a big consumer of final goods and could be also a big investor in public investment. So let's talk about national income, and we can say that national income, or the total income generated in an economy, expressed in monetary terms, is actually summing or adding up what this national income is used in terms of expenses. So actually the expenses are the consumption expenses as we have defined them. So the household consumption in goods, orders, and services that are for final consumption, plus the investment that firms do. Remember that the concept of investment is the capital goods that firms are using to produce more goods and services. So actually that's part of the income that is being used now for investment purposes, plus actually who spends in public goods It will be the government. So we have government expenditure. And the government expenditure is part of the national income that is being spent in public goods and merit goods as we have defined them. Now we're gonna add a couple more, which is the export revenue minus the import expenditure. So we're saying that the national income could also be spent in foreign goods. So foreign goods, or the foreign goods that we are spending because we're paying to the rest of the world, that will have a negative value, okay? So the negative value of GDP that is flowing out of the model, because actually it's an outflow of money that is actually going outside this country or this economy. So we have the negative import expenditure. So we call it M as the import expenditure, and it's a negative sign. But we have to add actually what the rest of the world is buying from us. So actually who is spending money? The rest of the world. We are selling goods to the rest of the world. That's the expenditure that is going outside of the country, but we are receiving back some money. So we are saying, well, the national income is also a function of people from the rest of the world buying goods. So let's call it export revenues. And those revenues are part of the national income. And of course, they have a positive value because the money is flowing into the country. So what we will define as net exports is actually this net value of the import expenditure, that is a negative, plus the export revenue, that is a positive. So in other words, the money that we are receiving by selling goods to the rest of the world, that's the X, minus the money that we are spending by buying goods from the rest of the world, that's the M. So X minus M is a net value that we need to add to our GDP, because that would mean, if we have a negative sign here, that the national income has some amount of money that is flowing out more than that we are receiving if the net value is negative. If we have a net value of X minus M positive, that means that the national income is increasing because we're selling more goods to the rest of the world than what we are spending from the rest of the world. Not necessarily that we're selling more, but we're actually receiving more money of what we are selling to the rest of the world compared to what we spend by buying goods from the rest of the world. Some people may say this could be a zero. Well, it's very unusual that we have an X minus M value that is zero, but if that happens, that means that everything that we are receiving from selling our goods to the rest of the world is outweighed because of what we're buying from the rest of the world. So that will be, this number will be zero, okay? So there's no net outflow or net inflow of money in terms of exports and imports. So I'm just going to go quickly because we have said that if everything that is being produced in an economy is also consumed, then we can say that in a closed economy, in autarky, Y equals C. So in other words, national income equals national consumption or household consumption. But because we have leakages and we have injections, we can say that all the leakages, which are taxes, savings, and import expenditure, could be injected back in the economy as government expenditure, investment, and also export revenue. We also said that the export revenue does not mean necessarily the same amount of the import expenditure. So that's why we have always here a negative sign or a positive sign, but it's very rare that we will have actually a zero sign. This is what we just talked in the last slide. However, we may say that all the money that is being saved is going to be reinvested in the economy via banks. And we can also say that the money that is flowing out of the economy via taxes is also going to be reinjected via government expenditures. We have a balance on the economy when all the leakages are being injected back into the economy. Therefore, the economy means all the leakages equals the investment, plus all the consumption means all the production. So the GDP should be in balance or should be in equilibrium when everything that is being produced is being consumed, including the leakages plus the injections. having into consideration this x minus m value that could be negative or positive, and may do a discrepancy in terms of what we are receiving versus what we are selling. Let's move on. We have the concept of marginal propensity, and this concept is an interesting one because that means that for each additional dollar that we receive in terms of income, there is a concept that is called propensity, or we can say it likelihood. So how likely it is that from this additional income that you're receiving, you will spend that additional income that you're receiving. Let me put it in a very simple example. Let's say that you guys receive $100 right now, that you receive a check in the mail that is saying your name, and it says you can spend this money as much as you want, or as you like, as free as you want. So how many of you will use this $100 in consuming goods and services right now, right away? Let's think about in the next 24 hours. So what would you buy with these $100 that the government is giving to you just for free, which could be a policy that right now we're about to see that is happening in many countries. If you have seen the news, in the USA, they are actually injecting or giving away almost, I think it's $2,000 per household. I'm not sure if that's the correct number, just because of the recession that is coming. The idea is for households to start spending that money and not allowing the firms to go into bankruptcy because nobody's buying anything right now. So that means we want the economy to keep running by just giving money to the households. We're going to talk about that, the implications of that a little bit later. Now, how many of you will use the $100 that you are receiving? So we're saying the injection, actually the increase is 100, okay, per person. So let's look at the marginal propensity concept. So how many of you thought, well, I'm going to use the $100 right now in the next 24 hours? And you may say, well, I'm going to spend $100 in inviting my family for a meal that is going to be a very nice luxury meal that someone will deliver to my house because right now we cannot go out. But that will cost $100. So that means that the injection that you are receiving, this extra $100 that you are receiving will be actually be used for consumption 100%, okay? So we may say the 100% is gonna go for consumption. However, some of you may say, I'm not gonna use the $100, I'm just gonna use part of the $100. Okay, let me do it a little bit less messy here. And say, for example, some of you may be thinking, okay, I'm gonna use in the next 24 hours, I'm gonna use $100, sorry, I'm not gonna use the $100, but I'm going to be using maybe $50 in the next 24 hours for consumption. Maybe you're gonna buy something in Amazon, okay? Speaker, headphones or whatever. So you're gonna use $50 and the other $50, you're gonna just put them aside. You're gonna set them aside. So you're gonna have savings. You're saying, I'm not gonna use the other $50 from this additional 100 that I was receiving, okay? That was the injection. You're saying, I'm gonna be using 50 for consumption and 50 are gonna be leaked out for savings. Even if you don't go to the bank because you are now stranded, you might put them under your pillow, let's say, okay? So what we see here is that from the 100, from the unit that you had, 0.5 goes for consumption, 0.5 goes for savings. So that means that for each dollar that you receive, this is how it is being distributed in a general manner. Okay, we're just trying to put the mathematical concept here. So in other words, you're saying the marginal propensity to consume is gonna be 0.5, and the marginal propensity or the likelihood to save is also going to be 0.5, okay? So for each dollar, this is the marginal propensity value. Some of you may say, well, in my country, if I receive $1, for each dollar that I receive, I have to pay maybe 30% of taxes, okay? That's something I already lost, okay? Because the government says you have to pay 30 of your taxes with every dollar that you receive. So we may say the marginal propensity to pay taxes is going to be 0.3. So what would happen with the 0.7 remaining? Maybe you are using again for consumption from the dollar. Maybe you're going to be using, let's say, 40 cents just for consumption. You already have taken away this for taxes, okay? And what is remaining is 20 cents that you may be saying, well, I'm going to be saving 20 cents remaining. So it will be 30 cents, wouldn't it? Yeah, so 30 cents for savings. So here we are adding up again to the unit. So in other words, from the $100 that you received, $30 are going for taxes, if that was the case. $40 are going to go for consumption, and $30 are going to go for savings for consuming in the future. So all of these should add up the 100, isn't it? So going back to the concept of marginal propensity, the marginal propensity or likelihood to pay taxes is already been set by the government, 30.3. The marginal propensity to consume, 0.4. And the marginal propensity to save, 0.3. That will be the unit at the end, okay? Finally, we have another marginal propensity, which is a marginal propensity to import. For every dollar that you consume, a certain proportion of that dollar goes away because we are living in a globalized economy. So not everything that you consume is being produced locally. So some proportion of whatever we buy is being made maybe in China, maybe in Japan, maybe in India, whatever the country is being produced, that part of the chain of production is going away from the country. So that's what we call the marginal propensity to import. So at the very end, just to follow, to end with this idea of marginal propensity, what we're looking at is from the unit, let me just clear this, erase here. So let's say from the unit, there's a certain proportion that is going to be used for consumption, certain proportion is going to be for savings, for tax purposes, and for imports. Remember we mentioned leakages? Well, we are just talking about leakages here. The marginal propensity for the injection to leak or to be withdrawn, to be flowing away from the system. So we're saying the additional amount of income, if this is the unit, okay, a certain proportion is going to be injected back into the system as consumption. Let's say 0.5. Say that 0.5 of this additional dollar that was injected was reused for consumption, okay? The injection was 1, but now you're using 0.5 for consumption inside the circular flow, okay? Now, all of these three are leakages, remember? We're saying savings, taxes, and imports are leakages. So there's a marginal propensity of leakage or marginal propensity to leak or to withdraw. We call this also withdrawals. So let's say if this is maybe again 0.3 of savings, maybe taxes is going to be 0.3. Let's keep the example of 30% of your income. And in this case, the remaining will be, let's say, oh, this is not possible. Sorry, because of the example being a mess here. Let's say maybe your taxes in this country were 10%, so 10 cents of the dollar goes to taxes, and then we're just having a remainder of 10 cents of imports. So at the very end, all of these should add up to the unit. So the marginal propensity of each dollar injected in the economy is reflected here. Marginal propensity to consume, 0.5. Marginal propensity to withdraw is going to be the remaining 0.5, okay? These numbers could change depending on your behavior. This concept we're going to come back later, and it's a very important concept because, as you may think, for each dollar that was injected, half of it has been leaked It may be invested later or it may be injected later, but half of it in this particular example was reinjected to the circular flow as part of the consumption, okay? So the implication of that is that this is suggesting that for each dollar that is being injected externally, okay, is going to be a certain proportion that is going to be reinjected, which is the consumption that is reinjected. Let's move on. I'm going to move on because I just want the concept to be here. We're going to come back to this concept later, and you may ask questions a little bit later too. I'm just being redundant here just to wrap up the concept of national income. National income means also national consumption. Everything that is being produced, or let's say everything that is being received in terms of income, is going to be used for consumption purposes, okay? The national output means also everything that has been produced means that the economy is going to be consuming it today or later. We don't really know. The time is a big constraint here, but if we're producing something, we expect that to be consumed. So once those goods are consumed, they're going to be counted in the GDP from the consumption side. Now, from the production side, they have been added into the GDP from the production side. Eventually, that will balance when people buy those goods, okay? Remember that we're talking about here the final goods produced. We said we don't want double counting, so we don't want to take intermediate goods, but the final goods that are produced ready to be sold. So let's define GDP as here as a consequence of everything that we have been talking about, as the total market value, because we're saying how much people pay for the goods in the market, expressed in monetary terms, of final goods and services produced inside the boundaries of an economy. GDP is the total market value of final goods and services. Let me correct this. All final goods and services produced inside the boundaries of an economy. What would you actually underline that is important for you to have in mind when you define GDP? Market value could be important. Well, yes. Expressing monetary terms, well, that's important too. Final goods and services, okay? We're not talking about the intermediate inputs that are needed to produce a computer. We're talking about the final value of the computer that is being ready to be sold. Produced inside the boundaries of an economy. So almost everything here is important to underline because we're talking here about inside the boundaries of a country, okay? So the GDP of China takes into consideration everything that's been produced inside China or all Chinese territories, as politically they define the country of China. Trinidad is an island or is a group of islands, JP, correct me. So everything that has been produced in Trinidad and Tobago is going to be counted as the GDP of that country. Now, why am I being so redundant in saying something that maybe makes sense? Because a couple of slides later, we will see that maybe someone inside Trinidad is not a citizen from Trinidad, but the GDP of what that person produces inside that country or that island is going to be counted because it's part of the boundaries inside that island or that country. Whatever is being produced inside Morocco is going to be counted in the Moroccan GDP. Spain GDP, the European Union GDP. However, we will see later that there are some people who live in those countries that may not be citizens of those countries, and when they take the money back to their home country, we call it repatriation of income, then that is going to be subtracted from the GDP of the country. Right now, we're defining the GDP as whatever is being produced inside the boundaries, regardless who produces that. What is included in the GDP? Now we said everything that is being produced and consumed legally. That's important. So drug market is not included in the GDP of many countries that they have not legalized drugs. How about all these pirate goods that we see in the streets, in the street markets, you know, CDs that are being copied and sold illegally in the economy, movies that are downloaded illegally. All of that is not counted in the GDP, only what is being legally produced. Only final goods, remember. It could be a tractor, it could be a machine, but the machine and the tractor are final goods. They are going to be used to produce other goods, but they are not going to be consumed as a final good. An apple is going to be consumed because you eat it, but a tractor is going to be used to produce other goods, but it's still a final good produced, okay? And not included, again, the opposite. So anything that is from the illegal economy. Remember, the economies do not have colors. We're just can talk it as illegal economy or shadow economy. Sometimes it's called the underground economy, but the correct term to use is the illegal economy. Sometimes it's called also informal. Things that people produce for themselves, that's not included in the GDP, even if we want to contabilize that. Let's say that here at Pearson, we have our greenhouse. The greenhouse is not counted in the GDP of Canada. Now, should that be counted? Well, of course, because that's something that we are using for consumption. But if we are not really selling that to someone, to anyone, it's not really registered anywhere, so it's not counted in the GDP of Canada. If we were buying those goods in the supermarket, then we will actually count them into the GDP. So there's a lot of countries in which a high percentage of this population, they produce what they eat, for example. Or they produce what they wear in some other countries. They actually produce their own clothes, and that's not counted in the GDP. Volunteer activities are not counted in the GDP. Intermediate goods, as we said, are not counted in the GDP. For example, the household work that we do in our houses, sometimes, for example, taking care of the children is not counted in the GDP. Whereas in some other countries, if you need someone to take care of your children because you are working, you have to pay for someone, and that will be counted in the GDP. So we're saying in some countries, the GDP cannot be compared because many, usually women are the ones who stay at home, and all the work that they do inside the home, like cooking and cleaning the house and raising the kids and making sure that the home is safe, all these different activities are not counted in the GDP of those countries because nobody's paying to these women, even if they are making a job. Whereas in other countries, all of those are different works or jobs that you would be paying someone to do. So we have interesting situations about how to measure the GDP and what is included and not included. Okay, what is included in your country's GDP? I'm gonna let you with that question to maybe research a little bit. Now let's look at these examples, okay? Let's try to see if we can answer this. First question, is this included in GDP? Next one, is the state spends 100 million in a new football stadium? Is this included in the GDP? Tourism increased by 20% from last year. Is this 20% included in the GDP of this year? A drug dealer buys a used AK-45 rifle in the street. Is it included in the GDP of your country? A baker buys $100 worth of sugar to use in making cakes that she sells. Is this sugar expenditure included in the GDP? You spend $15 to buy noodles made 100% in another country. Actually, the noodles were made in another country, and you are spending that $15 to buy those. Are they included in your GDP? And the last one, you bought some used shoes at Value Village, for example. Remember Value Village? Used goods. Is that included in the GDP? Let's look at the answers. First one, you charge your neighbors $10 to cut their grass. Well, if you are doing it just by word and you're not really issuing any receipt, and it's not really something that you have a business about, it's just doing it randomly, is a part of the illegal economy or the informal economy, okay? So it's not included in the GDP. The state spends 100 million, yes, it's included in the GDP. Government expenditure. Tourism increased by 20%. Yes, it is included in the GDP of this year because it's money flowing in. Tourism is counted as an export, okay? It's an export of your landscape, your scenery, your culture, whatever people are paying to come into your country. So it should be included in your GDP. The drug dealer and the AK-7047 rifle is not counted in the GDP because the rifle is used, first of all. If it was produced inside your country and it was new, then it will be counted, but in this case it's not. And the drug dealer actually is using money that is also illegal money. So we're talking about an underground economy in which actually that's how it works. There's a parallel GDP of these underground activities that people are doing in terms of drug dealing and traffic of illegal even people. So it's not counted. A baker buys $100 of sugar, not counted. Why? Intermediate good. Remember, the cakes are counted, but not the sugar. You spend $15. Well, it's counted in the GDP, but it's counted as a leakage, a minus. So you have to put minus 15 of the GDP of your country because the money is flowing out 100% of your GDP. And how about the Value Village shoes? Not counted because it's a used good, okay? Now, Value Village gives you a receipt because you will pay maybe $10 of shoes that were, the value of those shoes were actually maybe $80. So what Value Village is charging for in this case is just the service of giving you access to used goods. So you're not really paying for the good, but you're paying to Value Village as for the service of putting together lots of junk, okay? So actually the shoes are not really counted on the GDP, but you're paying to Value Village that service, which is what you actually paid for, and that is what is counted in the GDP, is what is being in the receipt, that is a legal receipt of the transaction that you made in Value Village. Questions so far? I'm gonna leave this slide here for you to think about who actually buys the goods. Households, so we have households, we have, how do we call this? They have the big C, the consumption, okay? Firms, if they buy machines and capital goods, we call it investment, okay? Capital stock, that's called investment. Government is also one who spends a lot in the economy. So they spend in infrastructure, merit goods, libraries, etc. So that's the big G. And the rest of the world, they will actually buy what we produce. So those are the exports that we sell to the rest of the world. So everything that we are spending is counted here. C, I, G, X, minus, remember, we are subtracting what we actually spend to the rest of the world. So who buys the goods is households, firms, government, and the rest of the world, minus what we spend buying goods from the rest of the world. So from the expenditure method, we have now our key, CIGX minus M. This is what we will call the GDP measure from the expenditure method, okay? We will actually name this as a very important concept, which is called aggregate demand. Everything that is being demanded in the economy is demanded by households as consumption, remember? Let me go over here. Firms as investment, government, and the rest of the world. So we call it aggregate demand because it's the total demand of goods and services being done by these agents in the ways that we have described so far. If we have an economy in equilibrium, everything that is being produced, total output, is being consumed by all these different agents that we have defined, okay? So total output means total consumption. In other words, aggregate demand means aggregate supply. Everything that is being supplied equals everything that is being demanded in terms of CIGX minus M, okay? So we call the AS and AD the national level of output, because as long as everything that is being produced is being consumed, we have the macroeconomic equilibrium, which is going to be the GDP value of a country. We're gonna move to the next slide in the next session, which is now putting together all the values of countries in real life, or we're gonna see actually real examples.